Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis, and this lesson is on the Cold War and the origins of the Cold War particularly. The Cold War generally it refers to an era of history, roughly from the end of World War II until collapse of the Soviet Union, which occurred officially in 1991. The Cold War was a transformative moment. It transformed not only U.S. foreign policy in the developing world and Europe across the world, but it also transformed U.S. domestic society. The Cold War, the nuclear arms race, really, on a fundamental level, shaped the domestic United States for decades. And in many respects, the Cold War and America's experiences in the Cold War are still shaping the United States, as a foreign policy power and domestically speaking to this day. And I think over the course of our lessons in this class, we'll see that to be abundantly clear. So, what is the Cold War? What do we mean when we refer to this? On the basic level, it is a standoff of superpowers. It is the non-shooting war between the Soviet Union and the United States that involves the two vying for the protection or advancement of global spheres of influence that go beyond just Europe, but also extend, ultimately to Asia and across the developing world. So it's a standoff between two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. Many historians have also argued that the Cold War is, at its very basic nature, a collision of empires. The U.S. empire, driven by the need and expansion for open markets to promote American-like systems, and the Soviet empire, driven more of a territorial empire, whereas the U.S. is more of an overseas empire. The Soviet empire, driven by a strict policy of political control and a foreign policy designed around the idea of insulating itself from what it saw as the designs of the capitalist world on Eastern Europe and other parts of the communist world. It's a global conflict, but it's of an indirect nature. The two superpowers don't fight, hence the word Cold War. Cold War generally refers to a non-shooting conflict. And that's only partially true. It's true that the Soviet Union and the United States never fought directly during the Cold War. However, the United States and the Soviet Union competed very intensely for a myriad of areas across the developing world. And this led to many high-level incidents. It also led to numerous proxy wars, coups, overthrowing governments, and in the case of conflicts like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, or the Afghanistan War in the 1980s, it often escalated into major large-scale interventions that cost unquestionable amounts of money and human lives on all sides. So the two superpowers don't fight, but they compete for areas of influence across the globe, particularly in the developing world. One of the great questions is what caused the Cold War. And historians argue about this, and they do not agree with this. They don't often agree with when the Cold War begins. But we can glean from the writings of historians some of the main points and understand some of the main aspects of the origin of the Cold War. So even though some scholars might value one as more significant over the other, we should look at some of the ways in which many scholars like John Lewis Gaddis or Patterson, who's famous for the book On Every Front, and many others, Walter Lefebvre, how they have dealt with the origin of the Cold War. So one of the big causes of the Cold War is economics. The other is strategic interest in national security, and the other is ideology. So we're going to talk about each of these and give examples of each of these. And then the last one, which cannot be discounted, is the issue of leadership. And here we see Harry Truman in the middle, with Joseph Stalin on his left and Winston Churchill on his right. Churchill, of course, is in your left in the picture, but he's on Truman's right, of course. Leadership mattered in the origins of the Cold War. So we have a number of different factors here. I'm going to talk about each of these and how they matter, but they're not just big sort of general components. Decisions made by individual leaders like Truman, like Stalin, were really, really integral to the origin of the Cold War. The first and main cause is, of course, leadership, and we have to consider the difference between FDR and Truman. So Franklin Roosevelt, here pictured at Yalta with Stalin and Churchill, FDR pursued a very different type of approach than Truman, and one of the great questions for historians after his death is, what would Roosevelt have done? How would Roosevelt have approached Stalin's acquisitions of territory in Eastern Europe? FDR largely during his time as president during the Second World War pursued something called a quid pro quo approach, and what this kind of meant was the idea that that you could imply certain things to Stalin. You could kind of, in a way, encourage the idea that you would be meeting Stalin on some of what his important demands were, and then use that as a way to get something out, a concession out of Stalin. So a quid pro quo approach is the idea, of give on one area and obtain on another area. So FDR pursued a much more sort of reasoned path with Stalin. He thought that, Stalin ultimately not somebody that they were very friendly with, as the posturing in this picture from the Yalta Conference in February 1945 discusses or demonstrates. But FDR nonetheless felt that you had to try to use diplomacy with Stalin to gain the best results that you could. At Yalta, some scholars have said that FDR implied the possibility of toleration in certain areas of Eastern Europe. Winston Churchill has also been noted as suggesting a similar thing to Stalin. Now, is this approach, the correct approach to deal with Stalin? Some will look back and say Stalin was a paranoid, almost madman dictator. Was this a person we could actually, have a working relationship with in this sense? While it's difficult to suggest that, Stalin was somebody that the United States could trust, I think many scholars certainly believe that the Truman administration, after Truman becomes president, not long after the death of FDR, probably could have done more to work with Stalin and possibly, we don't know, prevent the full development of the Cold War. So Truman was much more standoffish with Stalin. He played a hard line. Truman, when he became president, really was out of the loop. He was a new vice presidential pick by FDR. He had not been briefed on many things, including the atomic bomb. He had no idea what the United States' policies were. And the FDR leadership was partially responsible for that. And it was also partially a consequence of the fact that FDR only lived, roughly a month into his fourth term as the president of the United States. But regardless, when Truman becomes president, Truman very much, obsessed with the idea that he did not want to become victimized by the lessons of Munich, the Munich Conference from 1938. He did not want to become the next person to, fall to the blunder of appeasing aggressive power. And these types of perceptions on the Soviet Union held by Truman will really help to shape the early Cold War. Here you see, of course, at Potsdam, Truman with, of course, Churchill and Stalin. And it was here, of course, that Stalin is told about the bomb by Truman, but of course, Stalin already knew about this program, and this was an early source of animosities that would be at the core of the causes of the Cold War. The United States had shared the bomb program. Well, in a lot of ways, the British and American bomb program had some inherent connections. And so the British were in the loop when it came to the atomic bomb, but the Soviets weren't. And Stalin instead learned far before the Potsdam Conference that, in fact, the United States was developing this weapon. He found out about it, of course, through espionage. And so when Truman announces to Stalin that, the United States has this new super weapon, Stalin sort of acts like he doesn't know, but in reality, of course, he already knows. And that kind of distrust was at the core of some of the causes of the Cold War. So a little bit about Stalin. Stalin was not actually Russian. He was from the area of the country of Georgia, down in the Caucasus region, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Seas, from the city of Gori. Stalin had, of course, and here you see pictured, of course, Stalin and Lenin in 1919. Lenin came to ultimately, just on the eve of his death, he came to rather despise Stalin, and he began in the eve of his failing health, in the eve of Lenin's death in 1924. He very much began to gravitate more towards Trotsky over Stalin, and perhaps it's because Lenin saw the potential danger of Stalin becoming the supreme leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin's leadership in the Soviet Union was really the antithesis of everything that the philosophers behind communism had really promoted. Certainly, Stalin's Soviet Union looked nothing like what Karl Marx might have imagined. And certainly Lenin established some of the precedents, but I doubt very highly that one could suggest that Leninism would have looked the same as did Stalinism. Stalin constructed a cult of personality. He was calculating, he was paranoid, and this led to the brutal persecution of millions of Russian peoples, mass executions of kulaks who were murdered for their resistance to forced collectivized agriculture. He purges Russian society of what he sees as potential disloyal threats from really all sectors, including the military and his officer corps. He greatly resents and distrusts the United States and Great Britain. He really fundamentally believed that the USSR was, with the case of World War II and the Germans, he saw the USSR as that was basically evidence to him that the West, the capitalist world, sought to ultimately destroy the Soviet Union. And so he sees this out of the United States and Great Britain as well, and he believed fundamentally that the USSR had to have a buffer zone in Eastern Europe to protect against the United States and the West. This is really important because one of the key moments in the origin of the Cold War was what to do with Eastern Europe. Stalin is convinced that Eastern Europe basically must be brought into the broader Warsaw Pact, as it'll eventually be known, the broader Soviet Union, as satellite states that could act as a buffer against what he saw as the almost inevitable war of destruction that would be waged against the Soviet Union by the capitalist West. And so this perspective is really critical because this perspective will lead Stalin to take actions in places like Poland and in Germany and other parts of Eastern Europe that will really be at the core of what Americans feel the Cold War is all about: Soviet occupations in Eastern Europe. Here you see just a map of Eastern Europe, and so you can see the countries that are particularly in question with respect to Soviet designs on Europe out of a desire to have a buffer zone were particularly Poland, the eastern portions of Germany, as well as areas like Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, of course. These were all areas that were taken by the USSR, and of course today, after the fall of the USSR, are all independent countries, but these countries were made satellite states by Stalin, and this move by Stalin was really one of the most controversial as moves, and it was critical to beginning the tension associated with the Cold War. And obviously, Winston Churchill will sum this up best in 1946 when he, of course, infamously or famously, depending how you see it, refers to Stalin as having placed an iron curtain across Europe. Of course, the other major cause when you think about the Cold War is, of course, economics and ideology. The U.S. is a free market empire that is simultaneously anti-empire. And in both cases, in both the Soviet Union and the United States, we have this kind of interesting ideology and rhetoric where in both cases, both powers see themselves as fundamentally anti-imperial while simultaneously creating empires of a various form that they insist are inherent for the national security protection of one or the other. Walter Lefebvre, the famous historian who wrote some of the most significant revisionist works of history on the Cold War, particularly the book America, Russia, and the Cold War, which has multiple editions and it has a recent edition as well. Even though he began his writing in the 60s, he was a prolific scholar over multiple decades. He sees the Cold War from the American front as down to the need of the United States for open markets. He traces it back to an expansionist United States that in the late 1800s began to look overseas to China for markets for its burgeoning industrial economy. And of course, this led to the U.S. annexation of territories like Hawaii, territories like the Philippines, of course, as well as the numerous involvement of the United States in the Caribbean and Latin America militarily in the late 1800s and the early 20th century. So for Lefebvre, this is down to a free market empire. This is about most, in his view, about the economic drives of free market capitalism. U.S. ideology, of course, promotes individualism and individual freedom. And we very much have a perspective of American exceptionalism, democracy, the legacy of the successful American Revolution, and so forth. These are core principles to the heart of what the United States is all about, and these principles were seen by many in the United States, including, of course, Harry Truman, the president when the Cold War begins, as contrary to the ideology of the Soviet Union and thereby, opposed, right? The U.S. also, is a country with a very strong religious history from the Great Awakenings, of course. During the 1700s and the 1800s, the United States has a strong, religious trend in its history, and of course, this trend was really kind of reified during the Cold War as Americans tended to view the Soviet Union and the government tended to view the Soviet Union as an atheistic, anti-individualist empire. And it's for that reason that in the early Cold War, and particularly in the 1950s, you will see things emerge in the United States like the phrase, "In God we trust," on our money, the phrase, "Under God," in the Pledge of Allegiance, which of course, today is, you see that bumper sticker on a lot of cars. And I think a lot of folks in the United States don't really recognize that that was something that was added to the pledge, added to the currency, because of a reifying of our religious outlook, of Americans' religious outlook, against that of the Soviet Union, which was seen as an ideology associated with atheism. So the Soviet Union, with respect to ideology and economics, was to some degree atheistic, based on at least a refutation of organized religion. And, figures like Lenin and Stalin were enshrined within something you might call a cult of personality, which, in a way, this sort of almost religious obsession with these Soviet leaders, in a way, perhaps was a replacement for the role that organized religion played so importantly in the history of of Russia this time. Of course, religion doesn't go away. Russians don't stop being religious, but there is a sort of assault on organized religion in the Soviet Union. The communist empire is really attempting to insulate itself from incursions of capitalist imperialists through party doctrination and affiliation. They're anti-imperialist in practice, but they create their own empire, like did the United States. The Soviet Empire is primarily a landed empire. It's largely based on the idea of expanding territories and influence of Soviet communism as a way of insulating the Soviet Union from the designs of capitalist Western powers that leaders in the USSR see as, fundamentally driven to attack and destroy communism. Soviet system is based on a planned economy. It is not democratic, nor is it based on the idea of individual liberty in the way that the American system was established. So I just so that you can see these two countries are very, very different with respects to ideology and respects to economics, and both are inherently suspicious of the other for this reason. And these suspicions, when compiled with respect to the decisions of policymakers, these suspicions rooted from the difference in their economics, their ideology, really factor critically into fateful decisions that will lead to the beginning of the Cold War in the 1940s. Now, there's a number of different scholarly approaches on this topic. John Lewis Gaddis, famous historian, author of Strategies of Containment, probably his most famous book, he believed that the end of World War II brought the Soviets and the Western powers face to face, literally, which of course it did. And he believed that this kind of removal of the power structures of Central Europe made the Cold War inevitable. It brought these ideologically opposed powers face to face and effectively meant that the Cold War was almost an inevitable occurrence. Other scholars like Walter Lefebvre, the famous revisionist scholar, famous for his work on the development of the American Empire before the Cold War, as well as books like Inevitable Revolutions and America, Russia, and the Cold War. He believes that the Cold War is really caused by empire. It's caused by the imperial drive of the United States for overseas markets to feed its burgeoning industrial economy, and the Soviet Empire's sort of inherent drive to oppose this. Other scholars like Thomas Patterson, who wrote the famous book On Every Front, argues that the Cold War is caused most. He doesn't discount those other factors, but Thomas Patterson suggests that the Cold War is caused most by decisions that were made by policymakers in both the U.S. and the Soviet Union after World War II. Now, the other cause that we said there were several different causes to the Cold War: economics and ideology, personality and leadership, and of course also strategic interest. This map really tells us it really gives us an excellent visual for the Cold War. Now, this is the Cold War in the 1980s, but both of the powers, the major powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, seek to create global spheres of influence out of concern for national security. The U.S. believes that free markets is the only way to protect the U.S. Stability in the world, and the USSR believes it must insulate itself from the United States' free market empire. And so to do this, the Soviet Union constructs what eventually become known as the Warsaw Pact, in Eastern European buffer zone, particularly in places like Romania, Poland, East Germany, and so forth. The United States constructs NATO, building an alliance system across Western Europe and North America. And then, of course, across the developing world, the Soviet Union and the United States vied for the influence of countries throughout the developing world. Now, this map is the 1980s, so it doesn't convey exactly the perspective of the 1940s and 50s. Of course, China falls to communism in 1949, and so in the 1950s it was associated that China, on this map shown as sort of a non-aligned communist country, that China was in lockstep with the Soviet Union. And ultimately, with the death of Stalin, China takes a different path, and we see the development of something called the Sino-Soviet split. So some of the gray countries are indicating the non-aligned countries in 1980, in the 1980s. But overall, you can really get a feel for this global Cold War. Every little dot, a red dot, is an insurgency inspired by leftists. Every blue dot is an insurgency inspired by the Western influence of the capitalist West, the United States. And so out of strategic interest, over time, the United States and the Soviet Union not only engage in massive arms races, nuclear buildup as well, but there's also a intense competition for areas across the developing world, and this leads to a series of very, very destructive wars, particularly conflicts like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and of course the Soviet War in Afghanistan. I'll just put this up. I want to give you an idea. So when does the Cold War actually begin? Of course, no scholar really truly suggests that the Cold War began before World War II, but it's important to note that developments in the late 19th century, imperial expansion in Russia as well as in the United States, the Bolshevik Revolution, of course, with the emergence of the Soviet Union in 1917, these events very much establish the roots of the Cold War. Now, when does the Cold War actually begin? Most scholars either take the John Lewis Gaddis side of things, saying that it began with the end of World War II in 1945, that effectively Cold War at that point was inevitable, whereas other scholars usually date it, like Thomas Patterson, around 1947 with the development of American containment policy. And we'll talk more about this next week, but containment policy centered around the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and so on, which we'll talk more about that next week.